15 minutes. That is how long an Argentine Mirage 3 could stay in the fight over the Falkland Islands before it had to turn around and go home. 15 minutes, under ideal conditions, with 3 external fuel tanks, before bingo, before running for the mainland or dying in the sea. The British Sea Harriers, flying from carriers just 100 miles away, could orbit for hours, land, refuel, take off again. Nobody in Buenos Aires had told the Argentine pilots about this number before they went to war. They found out in the air. Capitan Gustavo Garcia Cuerva found out on the 1st of May, 1982, at 16:26 local time, high over West Falkland. He was in the fastest fighter in the South Atlantic. He was fully armed. He had the height, the speed, and a wingman on his right. Within the hour, he would be dead, killed by his own countrymen, his anti-aircraft gunners, his own side, 20-0. This is why the Argentine pilots who took off on the 1st of May, 1982, were not amateurs. They were not conscripts. They were not the second string. Grupo Ocho de Casa flew the Mirage 3EA, a French-built interceptor, Mach 2.1 at altitude, a delta-wing thoroughbred designed to climb straight up into the stratosphere and kill a Soviet bomber before it could reach Paris. On paper, it was one of the finest fighters in the Western Hemisphere. The pilots who flew it had been trained by men who had killed in real combat. Israeli veterans, instructors who had flown Mirages over the Sinai in 1967, over the Golan Heights in 1973. Men who had survived dogfights against Egyptian MiGs and lived to teach the next generation what it felt like when a missile lit up under your wing and you had 4 seconds to break or die. The Argentine Air Force had absorbed that knowledge. They believed it. They flew like men who expected to win. Teniente Carlos Rinque, a Skyhawk pilot from Grupo Cinco, later admitted something that should stop you cold. Before every combat mission, he calculated his personal odds of coming home. 50%. He flew anyway. Most of them flew anyway. These were the men the British were about to fight. And on paper, on every measurable scale of military power, the British were about to lose. To understand how the British ended up in the South Atlantic with an aircraft nobody wanted, you have to go back 16 years to a room in Whitehall in October 1966. The Labour government of Harold Wilson had a problem: money. Britain was broke, the empire was ending, and somewhere at the bottom of the Ministry of Defence budget was a project called CVA-01, a new strike carrier that the Royal Navy had spent a decade designing. The ship that was supposed to carry the Fleet Air Arm into the 1980s. Wilson cancelled it. The message to the Royal Navy was clear. Fixed-wing naval aviation was finished. The Fleet Air Arm, the service that had killed the Bismarck, the service that had crippled the Italian battle fleet at Taranto, was to be wound down. Air defense at sea would be handed to the Royal Air Force, flying from land bases. Carriers would rust and be scrapped as they aged out. The Royal Navy, to put it politely, disagreed. What happened next was one of the quietest revolts in British military history. The Admiralty did not argue in public. It did not resign. It schemed. The Royal Navy started building aircraft carriers again, and it did so by refusing to call them aircraft carriers. They were called through-deck cruisers. It was a phrase designed by civil servants to slip past politicians who did not read specifications. A cruiser with a flat top. A cruiser that could carry helicopters. A cruiser that, coincidentally, happened to be the exact right size to operate a small jump jet that the Admiralty had also been quietly funding through the back door. That jump jet had first hovered on a tether in October 1960. It was called the P.1127, then the Kestrel, then the Harrier. In 1980, exactly 2 years before the war, a naval version entered service. A bubble canopy for better visibility, a small radar called Blue Fox, 2 hardpoints for air-to-air missiles. It was called the Sea Harrier FRS Mark I. Nobody was afraid of it. It could not fly at Mach 2. It could barely fly at Mach 1 at all. Its top speed was around Mach 0.9. It carried 2 missiles. Its radar reached out 20 miles on a clear day. American Phantom pilots who flew mock combat against it in the North Sea laughed at it for a while. Then they stopped laughing. There was one man at the center of what the Royal Navy had built. His name was Nigel Ward. Everybody called him Sharky. By the spring of 1982, Lieutenant Commander Nigel Ward was the most experienced Sea Harrier pilot in the world. 3 operational tours on the aircraft, former commander of the Sea Harrier Intensive Flying Trials Unit, former commander of 899 Naval Air Squadron. Now, commanding 801 Naval Air Squadron aboard HMS Invincible. He was, by every account of everyone who ever served with him, professionally impossible. He argued with admirals. He argued with the Royal Air Force. He argued with anyone who told him what the Sea Harrier could not do, and he argued by climbing into one and proving them wrong. He drilled his pilots on the Blue Fox radar until they hated him. He drilled them at night. He drilled them in cloud. He drilled them in the kind of weather that grounded civilian aviation. He believed that if his squadron could not pick up a low-flying target the moment it crossed the horizon, they would die. He was right. Ward was not building fighter pilots. He was building a system. And on the 1st of May, 1982, the system was about to meet Capitan Gustavo Garcia Cuerva, 16:26 hours, high, over West Falkland. 2 Sea Harriers of 801 Naval Air Squadron were on combat air patrol. The lead was Flight Lieutenant Paul Barton, a Royal Air Force officer, on exchange with the Fleet Air Arm. His wingman was Lieutenant Steve Thomas. Diving on them from above were 2 Argentine Mirages of Grupo Ocho. Garcia Cuerva in the lead, Perona on his right wing. What followed took less than 4 minutes. Barton climbed into the fight. He maneuvered, patiently, without hurry, into a firing position behind the trailing Mirage. He waited for the tone. He heard the Sidewinder growl in his headphones. He squeezed the trigger. The AIM-9 Lima leapt off the rail. Seconds later, Carlos Perona was ejecting from a Mirage that no longer had a tail. His parachute opened. He came down on Pebble Island and was recovered by his own countrymen, men of the Argentine naval aviation. He would live to be an old man. He would never forget what he had failed to see. At almost the same moment, Steve Thomas fired at the second Mirage. His missile struck Garcia Cuerva's aircraft, not fatally, damaged, bleeding fuel. Garcia Cuerva dove into cloud to escape. When he came out the other side, he was low, alone, and burning through the last of his fuel 400 miles from home. There was only one friendly runway within reach, Port Stanley. He never made it to the runway. As his crippled Mirage descended toward the airfield, the Argentine anti-aircraft gunners on the perimeter, the men of Garda 601, had not been told that a friendly aircraft was inbound. They saw a fast-moving jet coming out of the clouds toward their base. They fired everything they had. 35mm cannon, 20mm cannon, machine guns. Argentine Navy 30mm guns deployed along the town joined in. Small arms opened up from the streets. They shot him out of their own sky. His Mirage came apart in the air over Port Stanley. He never had time to eject. Wreckage burned on the ground. Newsreel cameras filmed it. His body was never recovered. The first air-to-air kill of the war belonged to the British. The second belonged to Argentina against itself. And on the same day, a few hours later, over a different patch of sea, Teniente Jose Ardiles, cousin of the footballer Osvaldo Ardiles, a young man with a famous surname, was killed in his dagger by a British sidewinder fired by Flight Lieutenant Bertie Penfold. 3 Argentine aircraft lost on the first day of serious air combat, 1 killed by his own countrymen. 0 British losses. Somewhere in Buenos Aires, Brigadier Ernesto Crespo, the man responsible for Argentine air operations over the Falklands, began reading the debriefs. He did not yet understand what he was looking at. He would. To have to understand what killed Carlos Perona, you have to understand a piece of American engineering that most people alive in 1982 had never heard of. It was a missile. It weighed 190 pounds. It was 9 feet long. It had been designed at a naval weapons station in the California desert called China Lake, a facility so secret that most Americans could not have found it on a map. The men who built it there had a nickname for the finished product. They called it the Death Ray. It was not the first Sidewinder. There had been Sidewinders since the 1950s. The Bravo, the Delta, the Gulf. Every one of them worked the same way. A seeker head cooled by nitrogen, tuned to the infrared signature of a hot jet exhaust. The pilot had to maneuver behind his enemy, get on his tail, wait for the growl in his headphones, and then fire. For 25 years, that was how air combat worked. If the enemy was not behind you, you were safe. It was the fundamental rule. The whole geometry of a dogfight, the loops, the scissors, the yo-yos, the desperate turning battles that looked identical to what Battle of Britain pilots had done in 1940. All of it existed because a missile could only kill you from behind. The AIM-9 Lima broke that rule. Its seeker was cooled not by nitrogen, but by argon, down to a temperature so low that it could detect not just the exhaust plume of an enemy jet, but the faint infrared glow of the aircraft's skin, heated by friction with the air. It could see the airframe itself. It could see the leading edges of the wings. It could see the nose cone. It could kill you from the front. It could kill you from the side. It could kill you from above. It could pull 35G in flight. It ignored flares. It ignored countermeasures. And in the spring of 1982, the Royal Navy was the only military service on Earth that had it in operational service against a real enemy. The Argentines did not know. Nobody had told them. Capitan Pablo Carballo, a Skyhawk pilot from Grupo Cinco, was asked after the war by an American officer what it had felt like when his radar warning receiver lit up to tell him a missile had been fired at him. Carballo said, "Nothing." The American, thinking he had misheard, said, "How brave you must be." Carballo shook his head. "You do not understand. We felt nothing because our aircraft did not have radar warning receivers." Read that sentence again. The Argentine pilots flying over the Falkland Islands did not know they were being shot at until the aircraft next to them exploded. They did not see the launch flash. They did not hear the tone. They did not get the warning that every American pilot over Vietnam had come to depend on. Their aircraft were built for a different era, for a different war, for a threat model that assumed missiles could only come from behind, where a rear-view mirror was warning enough. And now they were flying against a missile that came from the front. Argentine wingmen watched their leaders burst into flame with no explanation. Formations came apart. Men called out over the radio in Spanish, asking what had just happened, and the answer came back, "I do not know. I did not see anything. You cannot fight what you cannot see. You cannot dodge what you do not know is coming." The AIM-9 Lima was not just a better missile, it was a different physics. The Royal Navy Task Force sailed south from Portsmouth on the 5th of April, 1982. On board its 2 carriers were only a modest stock of AIM-9 Lima missiles. Enough for the opening weeks, not enough for a war. What happened next was one of the most consequential acts of quiet alliance in the post-war history of the Western world. And it happened in a room in Washington, D.C., where 3 men made a decision that Argentina would not learn about until it was too late. Ronald Reagan, Caspar Weinberger, John Lehman, the President, the Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of the Navy. The United States was officially neutral in the Falklands War. Neutral. In public. In the newspapers. In the halls of the United Nations. Argentina was, technically, a partner in Latin America. The Reagan administration was building a Cold War coalition against communism. Argentina had helped train anti-communist forces in Central America. There were reasons, good, cold, strategic reasons, for Washington to stay out. Reagan did not stay out. According to John Lehman, later in his memoirs, the president's instructions to his Secretary of the Navy were simple. Not up for debate. Give the British what they need to finish this. Caspar Weinberger personally approved the emergency transfer of AIM-9 Lima Sidewinders from American stockpiles to the British task force. Missiles were flown to Ascension Island, the small British staging post in the mid-Atlantic, and transferred to Royal Navy ships heading south. Argentina did not know. They flew against a stockpile they thought was almost empty, against a technology they did not know existed, against an alliance that was not written down anywhere. They were fighting 3 countries. They only knew about one. Now, understand this. A great missile in the wrong aircraft, in the wrong place, with the wrong pilot, would have changed nothing. The Argentines had good missiles too. The Israeli-built Shafir 2 on their daggers was a respectable heat seeker. The French Matra Magic on their Mirage was modern. Why did those missiles not work? The answer is the number we started with. 15. The distances were not negotiable. They were fixed by geography. From Rio Grande to Port Stanley, 380 nautical miles. From Rio Gallegos, 435. From San Julian, 425. From Comodoro Rivadavia, 480. The Argentine Air Force had been built for a different war. It had been designed, equipped, and trained for short-range interception of Chilean aircraft over the Andes Mountains. Its aircraft had been chosen for a fight that started 10 miles from the runway, not 400 miles from the runway. The Argentine military possessed exactly 2 KC-130 Hercules tanker aircraft for the entire Air Force and the entire Navy combined. 2. And the Mirages and Daggers, the aircraft that were supposed to establish air superiority, could not be refueled in flight at all. They had no refueling probes. The capability did not exist on those airframes. It had never been retrofitted. There had never been a budget for it. An industrial decision made by unnamed men in Buenos Aires 10 years before the war had just decided who would win the war. The Argentine pilot climbed away from Rio Gallegos with a full load of fuel. He flew 435 miles east over open ocean. He descended into a fight where he had at most 15 minutes. He engaged. He fired his missiles. He tried to break contact. Then he flew 435 miles home. If anything went wrong, if he took battle damage, if he burned extra fuel in afterburner, if he had to jettison stores, he did not make it home. He went into the South Atlantic. Several Argentine pilots died that way. Not shot down, not killed in combat. They ran out of fuel and drowned. The Sea Harriers, by contrast, were operating from HMS Hermes and HMS Invincible, two carriers stationed roughly 100 miles east of the islands. Their endurance over the combat zone was measured not in minutes, but in hours. A Sea Harrier could orbit on combat air patrol, refuel on the carrier, take off again within 20 minutes, orbit again, all day. That was the whole story in one sentence. One chance against all day. And the Sea Harrier had something that mattered even more than range. It had availability. Lieutenant Commander Tim Gedge, who commanded 809 Naval Air Squadron aboard the requisitioned container ship MV Atlantic Conveyor, later put the number on record. His squadron flew close to 1,500 sorties during the campaign. Their mission-ready serviceability rate was 98%. 98. Read that again. In wartime, at sea, in the South Atlantic winter, with sea spray freezing on the rotors of helicopters and salt-corroding airframes that had been designed for European summers. 98% of the aircraft on any given day were flyable. HMS Hermes alone launched over 1,100 Sea Harrier sorties. The peak sortie rate reached 4 flights per aircraft per day. Per aircraft. Per day. That was not luck. That was the consequence of a design decision that had been made 15 years earlier. The Sea Harrier had been engineered, from the first drawing, to be maintained by a small team of sailors on a small ship in bad weather. Every fastener, every access panel, every line replaceable unit, every maintenance interval had been chosen for a deployed environment far from a hangar and far from a workshop. The aircraft was a logistical achievement before it was a combat one. The Argentines could not match it. Their Mirages had been designed for large mainland bases with deep maintenance support in countries with predictable climates. Their squadrons could not generate sorties at the rate the British could. The British were flying twice as much, with better missiles, against pilots who did not know what was killing them. By the second week of May, Brigadier Ernesto Crespo, the man responsible for Argentine air operations, had seen enough. He made a decision that broke his heart to make. He withdrew the Mirage 3s from offensive operations over the Falklands. The best pure fighters in the Argentine inventory. The Mach 2 interceptors, the aircraft that were supposed to establish air superiority. Sent home to the mainland to defend Buenos Aires against a British bomber attack that would never come. Crespo could not sustain the losses. He could not afford to lose more Mirages in a fight where they could barely stay long enough to shoot. The Daggers and the AFA Skyhawks were reassigned to strike missions only. Low, fast, straight in at the British fleet. No dogfighting, just bombs. The Canberras, the older bombers, were restricted to night sorties. Their loss rate in daylight was unsustainable. In less than 2 weeks, the Argentine Air Force had conceded the air-to-air battle. They had been beaten by a number, and still they came. This is the part of the story that must not be lost. The Argentine pilots who kept flying after the Mirages went home. The Skyhawk drivers, the Dagger pilots, the young men who kept climbing into cockpits, knowing they had a 50% chance of not coming back, were not fools. They were not being sacrificed by cynical commanders. They were volunteers who had decided that their country was worth dying for. They flew at 20 feet above the sea, below British radar, below the Sea Harrier combat air patrols. They ran the gauntlet of the fleet's air defenses: Sea Wolf missiles, Sea Dart missiles, 40mm Bofors guns, handheld blowpipe launchers, and the guns of every escort ship in the task force. And they kept coming. They hit HMS Sheffield, HMS Coventry, HMS Ardent, HMS Antelope, the Atlantic Conveyor, Sir Galahad. They sank ships and killed sailors. Teniente Jorge Bono, whose damaged Skyhawk lost fuel and went down into King George Bay, killing him. Teniente Danilo Bolzan, Teniente Juan Araras, Alferez Alfredo Vasquez. There is a list. It is longer than you would think. They flew anyway. On the 21st of May, 1982, the British landed at San Carlos on the north coast of East Falkland, the great amphibious operation that the entire campaign had been building toward. The Argentine Air Force threw everything it had at the beachhead. Wave after wave of Skyhawks and Daggers came in low over the surrounding hills, dropped into the anchorage the sailors were already calling Bomb Alley, and released their bombs on the frigates and landing ships packed into the Sound. Sharkey Ward was in the air that day. He was flying combat air patrol west of the islands when he picked up a flight of 3 Argentine Daggers on the Blue Fox radar. They were low, running in over West Falkland at high speed. He rolled in from above. He fired one IM-9 Lima at the leader. The missile guided true. The Dagger came apart in the air. Steve Thomas, his wingman, killed a second Dagger in the same engagement. Both Argentine pilots ejected. Both survived. Ward would later say of the Argentines, "We expected a harder fight than we got. But at the same time, we found them a very brave lot. They have lost so many already, and in they would come, much to our great admiration and respect for them." I have the highest respect. He was not being polite. He was being accurate. 3 days later, the 24th of May, Lieutenant Commander Andy Auld, the commanding officer of 800 Naval Air Squadron aboard HMS Hermes, was patrolling north of Pebble Island with Lieutenant Dave Smith when they were vectored onto 4 Daggers by HMS Broadsword. Auld rolled in from 10,000 feet. He fired both his sidewinders. He killed 2 Daggers in seconds. Teniente Castillo was killed in the cockpit. Major Puga ejected and survived. Dave Smith killed a 3rd Dagger. Captain Diaz ejected, survived. The 4th Dagger jettisoned its bombs and ran for home. He almost made it. He ran out of fuel over the South Atlantic and went into the sea. Auld was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross. His personal aircraft, tail number XZ-57, became the highest-scoring Sea Harrier of the war. 3 Daggers, killed in one afternoon by 4 missiles. The kill ratio was becoming grotesque, but the Sea Harriers were not invincible. They were dying, just not in the way anyone had expected. On the 4th of May, Lieutenant Nick Taylor of 800 Naval Air Squadron was flying a strike mission against the Argentine airstrip at Gooks Green. Anti-aircraft fire, a 30mm Oerlikon gun, caught his aircraft on the run-in. His Sea Harrier crashed into the peat. He did not eject in time. He was the first British pilot killed in the campaign. On the 6th of May, Lieutenant Commander John Eaton-Jones and Lieutenant Alan Curtis of 801 Naval Air Squadron were flying a combat air patrol southeast of East Falkland in appalling weather. Low cloud, no horizon. Radar contact between the two aircraft was lost. Neither pilot was ever heard from again. Neither wreck was ever found. It is believed they collided in cloud. On the 23rd of May, Lieutenant Commander Gordon Batt, who had already been awarded the Distinguished Service Cross for the attack on Port Stanley Airfield on the 1st of May, took off from HMS Hermes on a night strike mission. His Sea Harrier failed to climb away from the deck. It went into the sea a few hundred yards ahead of the ship. He was killed on impact. 4 men. Not one of them shot down by an Argentine pilot. Not one of them killed in an air-to-air engagement. Killed by ground fire. Killed by weather. Killed by the mechanical realities of flying a small jet off a small ship in the South Atlantic winter. The Fleet Air Arm buried its dead and kept flying. By the end of May, the pattern of the air war had become undeniable. Somewhere in Argentina, in a briefing room at Comodoro Rivadavia or Rio Gallegos, Brigadier Ernesto Crespo sat with his squadron commanders and tried to explain what he was seeing. He had lost aircraft he could not replace. He had lost pilots who had been the best in his air force. He had watched his Mirage force, his premier interceptor squadrons, his Mach 2 elite, pulled out of the fight because it could not stay long enough to matter. And still, the enemy carriers had not been sunk. Still, the Sea Harriers came off HMS Hermes and HMS Invincible every morning, and they went home every night. They were being flown by men. Crespo did not know. Men whose names would never appear in an Argentine newspaper. Men his pilots could not touch. He must have known, by the last week of May, what was going to happen at Bluff Cove. He must have known there would be one more chance and one more disaster. The 8th of June, 1982. On the southern coast of East Falkland, the war was almost over. British ground forces had broken out from the San Carlos beachhead. 2 Guards battalions, the Welsh Guards and the Scots Guards, were being moved forward by sea to the assembly area for the final assault on Port Stanley. They were embarked on 2 Royal Fleet Auxiliary landing ships, Sir Galahad, Sir Tristram. Both ships anchored in the exposed water of Port Pleasant, off Fitzroy Settlement, in broad daylight. Somebody had made a mistake. Somebody had assumed the Argentines could not see them. Somebody was wrong. At just after 1 o'clock in the afternoon, 5 A4B Skyhawks of Grupo Cinco came in from the west, low, fast, under the radar horizon. They had launched from Rio Gallegos. They had flown 435 miles over open ocean. They had one pass. They took it. 3 bombs from a Skyhawk flown by Lieutenant Carlos Cachon hit Sir Galahad. The ship caught fire from the engine room forward. 48 men died aboard her. 32 of them Welsh guardsmen. 11 other soldiers. 5 crew. Many of them burned. It was the single worst British loss of the war. Sir Tristram was hit too. 2 more dead. Hong Kong Chinese sailors are serving as merchant crew. The Skyhawks pulled up over the hills, jettisoned their empty racks, and turned west for the long flight home. They almost made it. Flight Lieutenant David Morgan, an RAF pilot on exchange with 800 Naval Air Squadron, was on combat air patrol with his wingman, Lieutenant Dave Smith. They were vectored south toward Choiseul Sound by the fighter direction officer aboard HMS Hermes. Morgan came down through the cloud at low level and saw 4 Skyhawks below him, heading west, right on the deck. He rolled in. He fired his first Sidewinder at the trailing aircraft. The missile guided into the Skyhawk's tailpipe. The aircraft came apart in the air. Teniente Juan Araras. Morgan fired his second Sidewinder at the next aircraft in the formation. It struck home. The Skyhawk exploded. Teniente Danilo Bolzan. Dave Smith fired at the third Skyhawk. His missile guided true. Alferez Alfredo Vasquez, 3 Argentine pilots, killed in less than 90 seconds. 3 young men who had just delivered the deadliest bomb strike of the war. The fourth Skyhawk, damaged, its pilot alive, turned west and disappeared into the haze. He made it home. David Morgan and Dave Smith returned to HMS Hermes. Morgan was later awarded the Distinguished Service Cross. It was the last air-to-air kill of the Falklands War. 6 days later, on the 14th of June, 1982, Brigadier General Mario Menendez signed the instrument of surrender at Port Stanley. The war was over. The Sea Harriers flew over 2,300 sorties from the 2 carriers. 20 Argentine aircraft were destroyed in air-to-air combat. 0 Sea Harriers were lost in air-to-air combat. Not 1. 6 Sea Harriers were lost in total. 2 to Argentine anti-aircraft fire. 4 to accidents. None to enemy aircraft. Of the AIM-9 Lima Sidewinders fired in the campaign, roughly 87% hit their targets. There has never been a guided weapon in the history of air combat that performed at that level in a real war. Not before 1982, not since. The Argentines had almost won. Read that again. The men who had been beaten in the air had come within a handful of seconds of winning the war. The bombs the Skyhawks and daggers had dropped on the British fleet, the low, fast, danger-close strikes that had sunk Sheffield and Coventry and Ardent and Antelope, that had crippled Atlantic Conveyor and Sir Galahad. Those bombs had been dropped from altitudes so low that the fuses often did not have time to arm properly before impact. Up to half of the Argentine bombs that struck British ships did not explode. At least 13 bombs, confirmed, struck, did not detonate. Marshal of the Royal Air Force Lord Craig said it plainly, years after the war, 6 better fuses and we would have lost. 6 seconds of fuse delay, 6 pieces of ordnance. That was the margin between the outcome we know and an outcome in which the British task force disintegrated in the South Atlantic and the flag over Port Stanley never came down. The Argentine pilots who kept flying against the British fleet in aircraft that could barely stay long enough to shoot, dropping bombs that half the time did not go off, came that close. Not because they were lucky, because they were brave. After the war, Brigadier Ernesto Crespo gave a series of interviews to the Argentine press. His tone was not bitter. It was forensic. He explained that his Mirage 3s had been trained for high-altitude interception. The British had refused to give him a high-altitude target. The Sea Harriers stayed low, between 2,000 and 4,000 feet, where the Mirage's energy advantage evaporated, where the Sidewinder seeker was clearest against the cold sea below, where every Mirage pilot was burning fuel he could not afford to burn. A later study by the Royal Military College of Canada concluded that the British had appeared to give the Argentines every advantage: high altitude, low numbers, a slower aircraft. They had not. The Argentines had been trapped by their own equipment. Their Mirages could not fight at the altitude the Harriers chose to fight at. Their pilots could not stay long enough to matter. Their missiles could not lock from the front. Their aircraft could not warn them when they were being fired upon. Their tankers could not reach them. Their industrial base could not sustain them. Here is the answer. The answer the Argentine pilots could not give. They lost because of everything that was not the airplane. They lost because in 1966, the British Admiralty refused to obey its own government. They lost because in the 1970s, engineers at China Lake in California figured out how to cool an infrared seeker with argon gas. They lost because in 1980, a small jump jet called the Sea Harrier entered service with a radar that Sharkey Ward would spend 2 years teaching his pilots to master. They lost because in April 1982, Ronald Reagan told his Secretary of the Navy to give the British what they needed and asked no questions about the cost. They lost because their Air Force had been built for the wrong war, and nobody had told them. The Argentine pilots were not worse men. They were not worse flyers. Their aircraft, on paper, were the equal of anything the British had. Their courage was greater than most of their enemies believed possible. They did not lose to bravery. They lost to a system. And the system had been built quietly over 20 years by men whose names they would never know, in rooms they had never been in, for reasons that had nothing to do with the Falkland Islands. Bravery does not defeat a system. Bravery only decides what the numbers look like on the way down. Say the names. Capitan Gustavo Garcia Cuerva, killed by his own countrymen over Port Stanley. Body never recovered. Teniente Jose Ardiles, cousin of the footballer, killed in his dagger on the same first day. Teniente Castillo, killed in his dagger over Pebble Island on the 24th of May. Teniente Juan Araras. Teniente Danilo Bolzan. Alferez Alfredo Vasque. All 3 killed in less than 90 seconds over Choiseul Sound. Teniente Jorge Bono went into the sea in a damaged Skyhawk, never seen again. On the British side, Lieutenant Nick Taylor, anti-aircraft fire, Goose Green, 4th of May. Lieutenant Commander John Eaton-Jones, Lieutenant Alan Curtis, lost together in cloud on a combat air patrol, 6th of May. Neither aircraft ever found. Lieutenant Commander Gordon Batt crashed on takeoff, 23rd of May. 20 Argentine aircraft killed by another airplane. 6 British pilots, none of them killed by another airplane. 20-0. Sharkey Ward died on the 17th of May, 2024. He was 80 years old. He had spent the 42 years between the war and his death arguing, often loudly, often inconveniently, often to people who did not want to hear it, that the Royal Navy should never again be allowed to lose its carrier air capability, that the lessons of the South Atlantic should not be forgotten. He watched the Sea Harrier, retired from Royal Navy service in 2006. He thought that was a mistake. He may have been right. David Morgan, the RF pilot who killed 2 Skyhawks over Choiseul Sound, is still alive. He is in his late 70s now. He lives in Dorset. He teaches aerobatics from a small airfield, flying an old wooden tiger moth. He wrote a memoir about the war. He called it Hostile Skies. The men who flew the Sea Harrier are old now. Many of them are gone. The names on the squadron boards at Yeovilton are starting to fade. The memory survives only if we keep saying the names out loud. Say them. Andy Old, Sharkey Ward, Steve Thomas, Paul Barton, David Morgan, Dave Smith, Bertie Penfold, Mike Blissett, Clive Morrell, Tim Gedge, Rod Fredrickson, Gordon Batt, Nick Taylor, John Eaton-Jones, Alan Curtis. 20 Argentine aircraft destroyed in air-to-air combat, 0 Sea Harriers lost in air-to-air combat. And somewhere in the South Atlantic still is the wreckage of a Mirage 3EA, nose down in the peat outside Port Stanley, burned by the fire of the guns that were supposed to protect it. Capitan Gustavo Garcia Cuerva never came home. His body was never recovered. His country said he died a hero. He died confused. He died in an airplane that had been designed to fight the wrong enemy, on the wrong day, in the wrong ocean, 400 miles from the runway he had trained his whole life to defend. He never had a chance, not because he was weak, because the system that surrounded him had been decided decades before he took off, in industrial choices, in budget decisions, in cabinet meetings held in countries he had never visited, by men he would never meet. That is the truth of the Falklands Air War. That is why the pilots could not explain what had happened to them. They were not fighting the Sea Harrier. They were fighting 1966, and the engineers at China Lake and Sharkey Ward's radar drills at midnight in the North Sea, and the quiet decision of an American president in April of 1982. They were fighting time itself, and time had already decided